He was the kind of comedian who could make anyone laugh, his quick wit and infectious smile lighting up any room he entered. His stand-up specials were legendary, his humour a perfect blend of sharp observation and playful absurdity. So, when he asked me out, I jumped at the chance, eager to spend an evening basking in his glow. We met at a trendy bar, the kind of place where the drinks are overpriced and the atmosphere is electric with the hum of conversations and laughter. He was just as I had imagined, charming, effortlessly funny, and completely at ease in the world of celebrity. The night started off with light banter and stories that had me in stitches, but as the evening wore on, something in his demeanour began to shift. The jokes grew darker, laced with an undercurrent of bitterness that I hadn't noticed before. He made offhand comments about death, about the futility of life, each delivered with the same casual smile that had once made me laugh, but now made me uneasy. It was during one of these moments that he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you ever heard of the Jester's curse?" His eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, half expecting another joke, but the look on his face was dead serious. "It's an old story," he began, his tone ominous. "There was once a jester who entertained a king, making him laugh through even the darkest of times. But one day, the jester told a joke so twisted, so dark that it drove the king mad. In his rage, the king cursed the jester, dooming him to a life where he could only bring misery, disguised as humour." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was being serious or just trying to spook me. But the way he looked at me, his smile fading into something more sinister, made my blood run cold. The bar, which had been filled with the buzz of chatter and laughter, seemed to grow quieter, the shadows in the room deepening as if the light was being drained away. The other patrons continued with their conversations, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. But I felt it acutely, a growing sense of unease, like something was watching us from the darkness. He continued to joke, but the humour had taken on a macabre edge, each punchline cutting deeper, leaving a lingering chill in its wake. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was just part of his act. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere growing louder in my ears. The lights in the bar flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into my bones. I glanced around, trying to find the source of my discomfort, but everything appeared normal, except for him. He grabbed my hand suddenly, his grip ice cold, his eyes pleading with a desperation that belied the smile on his lips. "You need to leave," he whispered urgently, "before it's too late." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I yanked my hand free and bolted out of the bar, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I was safely inside my apartment, the door locked behind me. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something dark and twisted. The next morning, I found out he had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. The media was full of speculation, depression, burnout, the pressures of fame. But I knew better. The Jester's curse wasn't just a story. It was real, and it had claimed another victim. I tried to move on, to forget the night that had started with laughter and ended in terror, but I couldn't. The memory of his desperate eyes, his chilling words haunted me. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I would hear the faintest echo of laughter, dark, twisted, filled with a torment that sent chills down my spine. It was then that I knew the curse hadn't just taken him. It had left a part of itself with me, a shadow that would never fully fade.
Meeting him felt like a surreal twist of fate, a convergence of fantasy and reality that I never imagined possible. His movies had always captivated me, not just because of his looks, but because of the depth and intensity he brought to every role. When our paths crossed at an industry event, I was just another face in the crowd, but something in our brief interaction sparked his interest. The next thing I knew, I was sitting across from him in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The evening started like a dream. He was charming, attentive, and as magnetic in person as he was on screen. We talked about everything, his latest film projects, my own mundane life, and the pressures of fame. Yet, as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible at first. The lighting, which had been warm and inviting, seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows in the room deepening into pools of darkness that seemed to creep along the walls like living entities. I tried to focus on our conversation, but there was a growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my awareness. His eyes, which had initially sparkled with a playful light, now seemed to hold something darker, something predatory. When he asked me if I ever felt like I was being watched, his voice had an eerie calmness that sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a laugh, dismissing his question as an attempt at flirtation. But then he told me about the shadows. "They follow me," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Ever since that last movie, they've been with me." I stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was serious or just trying to scare me. The movie he was referring to was a psychological thriller about a man haunted by unseen forces, an unsettling film, but fiction nonetheless. Or so I thought. As the evening continued, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. They crawled up the walls, pooled in corners, and shifted in ways that defied the logic of light and shadow. I felt their presence more acutely with every passing minute, as if they were watching me, waiting for something. He noticed my discomfort and smiled, a smile that was more of a leer. "They like you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're drawn to fear." I could no longer hide my unease. I wanted to leave, to run, but something in his gaze held me there, frozen in place. The shadows were no longer just a trick of the light. They were tangible, almost sentient, and they were closing in. Finally, the check arrived, and the spell seemed to break. He walked me to his car, the night air heavy and suffocating. The city lights flickered as if struggling to stay on, and the streets, usually bustling even at this hour, were eerily deserted. The shadows had followed us outside, slithering along the pavement, stretching towards us like fingers of darkness. I refused his offer to drive me home, muttering some excuse about needing to walk off the wine. But he was insistent, his grip on my arm firm, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You'll be safe with me," he said, though it felt less like reassurance and more like a command. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, turning and bolting down the street. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. The door slammed shut and locked behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the shadows hadn't followed me inside. The next morning, the news broke. The actor had been found dead in his home, an apparent suicide. The headlines were full of speculation about the pressures of fame, the dark side of celebrity, but none of them knew what I did. The shadows had claimed him, just as he had warned, and I had narrowly escaped their grasp. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting for another moment of vulnerability. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake to find the shadows in my room a little too thick, a little too dark, and I would wonder if they had finally found me again.
When he invited me to his mansion, I was beside myself with excitement. He was one of the most iconic musicians of our time, a living legend whose voice had been the soundtrack to my life. His invitation felt like stepping into a fantasy, a chance to glimpse behind the curtain at the life of someone I had idolized for years. His mansion was everything I had imagined it would be, grand, opulent, and filled with treasures from a career that had spanned decades. The rooms were vast, decorated with gold records, priceless art, and memorabilia that spoke of a life lived in the spotlight. Yet, as I crossed the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside the mansion was thick with an oppressive melancholy, a sadness that seemed to cling to the very walls. It was as if the house itself was grieving, weighed down by the memories of a past that refused to let go. Every step I took echoed through the empty halls, the sound swallowed by the vast, cavernous spaces. He greeted me with a warm smile, but there was something off about him, something that didn't quite match the public persona I had seen so many times before. His eyes, once bright with the fire of creativity, were dull, hollow, as if the spark that had once driven him had been extinguished. He led me through the house, pointing out various pieces of his life's story. Guitars that had been used to write iconic songs, framed set lists from legendary concerts, awards that glittered under the dim lights. But the more he showed me, the more I felt the weight of his world pressing down on me. We eventually reached the dining room, where a grand piano sat in the corner, its once polished surface now covered in a fine layer of dust. "I don't play anymore," he said quietly, almost as if he were confessing a sin. "The music, it doesn't come to me like it used to." We sat down to dinner, but the food was an afterthought, both of us barely touching our plates. The conversation drifted towards the past, his stories growing darker, filled with regret and loss. He spoke of friends who were gone, of the isolation that came with fame, of the relentless pressure to be someone he no longer felt he was. After dinner, he offered to give me a tour of the rest of the mansion. I agreed, though a part of me wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. As we walked through the dimly lit halls, I noticed the portraits on the walls. They were all of him, captured at different stages of his life, but there was something unnerving about the way the eyes in the paintings seemed to follow me, their expressions shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly. He led me to a room at the far end of the house, its door heavy and ornate, as if guarding something precious. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, pictures of women, all beautiful, all with the same vacant look in their eyes. My heart skipped a beat as I realized they were all women who had been linked to him over the years, all women who had vanished from the public eye under mysterious circumstances. I turned to him, my throat dry, but before I could speak, he sighed, a sound filled with a deep, weary sorrow. "They all wanted something from me," he said, his voice distant, as if he were talking to himself. "They wanted more than I could give." I backed away, the urge to flee overpowering, but the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The room grew colder, the air thickening as if the house itself was closing in around me. He didn't move, didn't try to stop me, but his presence was overwhelming, a silent force that held me in place. "You'll stay too," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, as if my fate had already been sealed. I turned, desperately trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, the women's faces contorting into expressions of terror and despair, their eyes pleading with me, warning me. In the end, I don't know how I managed to escape. The details of that night are a blur, a nightmare I can barely remember without feeling a deep sense of dread. But as I ran through the darkness, the mansion behind me disappearing into the night, I knew that something had changed in me. I had seen the true face of fame, and it was something monstrous, something that had nearly swallowed me whole. The next day I heard the news. The musician had been found dead, alone in his mansion. The cause of death was a mystery, but I knew the truth. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. And though I had escaped with my life, a part of me remained trapped in that mansion, haunted by the ghosts of those who had come before me.
He was a master of horror, a director whose films were known for pushing the boundaries of fear and suspense. His work had always fascinated me, not just for its ability to terrify, but for the way it lingered in your mind long after the credits rolled. When he invited me to his house for a private screening of his latest movie, I felt both excited and honored. It was a chance to peek behind the curtain of a mind that had crafted some of the most chilling stories of our time. His house was as eerie and atmospheric as I had expected. A sprawling, Gothic mansion perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the stormy sea. The drive up the winding road with the wind howling and the waves crashing against the rocks below felt like the beginning of one of his films. By the time I arrived, the sky was dark, the air heavy with the promise of rain. He greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his presence as commanding and enigmatic as his reputation. The inside of the mansion was a labyrinth of dark wood, antique furniture, and walls lined with strange, unsettling artifacts. It was as if the house itself was a character in one of his films, a living entity that breathed in the darkness and exhaled a sense of foreboding. He led me to a private theater room, where the lights were dimmed to an almost oppressive level. The room was small, intimate, with plush leather seats that seemed to swallow you whole. The walls were adorned with posters from his films, each one a reminder of the nightmares he had brought to life. We settled into our seats, and the movie began. It was everything I had expected. Brilliantly crafted, each scene meticulously designed to build tension and unease. But as the film progressed, I started to feel a strange sense of disconnection, as if the boundary between the screen and reality was blurring. The scenes felt too vivid, the screams of the characters echoing in my mind with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then I saw her, a woman on screen who looked uncannily like me. She was running through a house, her face a mask of terror, the camera following her every frantic movement. The house she was in was disturbingly similar to the one I was sitting in, down to the smallest details. My heart began to race as I watched her stumble through the dark corridors, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the camera closing in on her panic-stricken face. I turned to him, but he was watching me, not the screen. His eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Isn't it amazing how art can imitate life?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The movie reached its climax. The woman was cornered, trapped in a room filled with the same eerie artifacts I had seen earlier in the mansion. The camera zoomed in on her face, her eyes wide with terror, and then the screen went black. Before I could process what was happening, the lights in the theater went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I heard a faint click, and suddenly the walls of the room began to shift, revealing hidden passages, secret doorways that led into the depths of the house. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped in the very nightmare I had just watched. His voice echoed through the darkness, calm and detached. You see, I needed a new inspiration, someone who could bring my next story to life. The hidden passages groaned as they opened, and I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. I ran blindly through the maze of corridors, the walls closing in on me, the air thick with dread. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, feeding off my fear twisting reality into a grotesque parody of the film. The details of my escape are a blur, a frenzied scramble through dark hallways and hidden rooms, each one more terrifying than the last. I don't know how I managed to find my way out, but when I finally stumbled out into the stormy night, the mansion was gone. In its place was an empty lot, as if the house had never existed. The director vanished without a trace, and his new movie was never released. The police investigation turned up nothing. The mansion's location a mystery even to them. But I knew what had happened. The House of Horrors had claimed its latest victim, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for its next unwitting guest. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the echoes of those footsteps, the soft creak of hidden doors, and I wonder if the nightmare will ever truly end.
He was a literary genius, a writer whose books had captured the imaginations of millions. His words were magic, weaving intricate tales of love, loss, and the supernatural that lingered in your mind long after the final page. When he asked me to dinner at his secluded estate, I was thrilled. It was an opportunity to meet the man behind the stories, to see the world through the eyes of someone who had mastered the art of storytelling. His estate was deep in the woods, far from the noise and distractions of the city. The drive there was long and winding, the road narrowing as the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. By the time I arrived, the sky was a deep, dusky blue, the air filled with the scent of pine and earth. The house itself was a beautiful, old stone mansion, the kind of place that seemed to have a history written into its very walls. Inside, it was warm and inviting, filled with the comforting scent of old books and polished wood. Every room was lined with shelves upon shelves of books, their spines worn from years of use. He welcomed me with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling with the same mischief I had imagined when reading his novels. Dinner was a quiet, intimate affair, just the two of us at a large oak table, the only sounds the crackling of the fireplace and the soft clinking of silverware. After dinner, he offered to show me his latest manuscript. I eagerly agreed, and he led me to his study, a cozy room with walls lined with books and a large antique desk at its center. On the desk was a thick, leather-bound book with no title, its pages filled with his distinctive, meticulous handwriting. "It's my most personal work yet," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. As I began to read, I was drawn into the story, a tale of obsession, madness, and the supernatural. The protagonist was a woman, her life eerily similar to mine. The more I read, the more I noticed unsettling details, things that only someone who knew me intimately would know. I glanced at him, but he was watching me intently, his expression unreadable. "Keep going," he urged. The story grew darker, more twisted. The protagonist found herself in a relationship with a famous writer, a man who slowly, insidiously took control of her life. As I read, I felt a growing sense of dread. The words seemed to blur, the lines between fiction and reality dissolving. Then, I reached a passage where the protagonist was sitting in a study, reading a manuscript, just as I was. My heart raced as I read the description of the room. It was identical to the one I was in. The protagonist turned the page, and I did the same, my hands trembling. The next passage described how the writer would weave his words into reality, trapping his muse in a world of his own creation. I looked up at him, and his smile was cold, predatory. "You're almost at the best part," he whispered. I tried to close the book, but my hands wouldn't obey. The words seemed to pulse, drawing me in deeper. The story continued, detailing how the protagonist became lost in the manuscript, unable to escape the narrative that the writer had crafted for her. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the story and reality fused into one. I felt myself slipping, my mind being drawn into the pages of the book. He watched, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction, as I became part of his story. The next morning, the police found the estate abandoned, the writer gone without a trace. On the desk in the study, they found a manuscript, the last page describing a woman disappearing into the words of the story, never to be seen again. They say that if you read the manuscript, you can still hear her voice, faint and desperate, calling out from the pages, trapped forever in the living nightmare the writer created.